Welcome to the deep dive. I'm genuinely glad you decided to join us today. If you're someone who actively seeks out complex, paradigm-shifting ideas and, doesn't shy away from challenging historical narratives, you're definitely in the right place.
Yeah, absolutely.
But before we get into the heavy lifting of today's analysis, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe to the show.
It really is the best way to support this deep dive format.
Exactly. It ensures you never miss our breakdowns of the source material. And today's focus is, it's undeniably massive. We're looking at a newly released, highly polarizing ebook titled Birth, A Radical Awakening.
Authored by Connie Riker.
Right, Connie Riker.
Yeah.
And to set expectations immediately, this is not a clinical guide to pregnancy. You will not find hospital bag checklists or nursery decorating tips in these pages.
No, definitely not.
This text operates as a radical manifesto. It fundamentally re-examines the biological, spiritual, economic, and intensely political dimensions of childbirth.
That categorization is completely accurate. And before we unpack a single argument from the text, we have a vital responsibility to you, the listener, to establish the parameters of this discussion.
Very true.
Because the source material we're examining today contains highly politically charged, uncompromising content. The author's thesis includes fierce critiques of what she defines as patriarchal structures. It actively attacks ideologies she associates with cultural Marxists.
Yeah, she doesn't hold back.
She doesn't. And it repeatedly advocates for unapologetic female supremacy as a structural necessity. So we must make it unequivocally clear that our role here is not to take sides.
Right, we are not taking sides.
We are not endorsing the author's political viewpoints, nor are we here to condemn them. Our mission is strictly analytical. We are acting as impartial guides through a deeply controversial text.
We're just looking at the architecture of the arguments.
Exactly. The goal is to unpack the history, analyze the sociological data the author cites, and really help you understand how she builds her arguments so that you can better navigate the broader cultural dialogue surrounding reproductive rights.
Right, we're dissecting the anatomy of the argument, not adopting it as our own. And the architecture of this book is just vast. We're going to trace a massive historical arc today.
We are.
The text starts by examining the ancient cross-cultural spiritual reverence for the womb before analyzing how that ontological framework was systematically dismantled.
Unpacked piece by piece.
Yeah, and from there, we're looking into the deeply unsettling origins of modern obstetrics, the neurobiological realities of birth that shatter the whole cultural myth of the blissful delivery.
Oh, that's a huge section.
It is. And the sprawling, multi-billion-dollar medical-industrial complex that the author argues has entirely commodified the birthing process.
And finally, we'll examine systemic racial disparities in maternal care, the influence of modern media, and the author's ultimate, highly controversial vision for an intersectional birth revolution.
It's a dense, provocative journey. So let's get right into the foundational premise. The first major section of the book doesn't start in a modern hospital.
No, it starts in antiquity.
Right. The core thesis here is that the womb was historically understood not as a passive biological incubator, but as the supreme sacred space, what the author terms the cosmic matrix.
Right, the cosmic matrix. And she builds this premise through a fairly exhaustive comparative religious analysis. She's arguing that prior to the medicalization of the human body, the womb was universally acknowledged as the literal epicenter of divine creation.
She looks closely at Hinduism to anchor this point, doesn't she?
Yeah, she does. In Hindu cosmology, the concept of the womb is not merely human. It's the matrix from which the entire universe emerges.
Wow.
The text cites the mythology of Kashyapa, born from the cosmic womb of Brahma, and places heavy emphasis on the reverence for the divine feminine through figures like Durga and Kali.
And those goddesses are critical to the argument, right? Because
Yeah.
they don't represent a sanitized, passive version of femininity.
Exactly. They embody both fierce, destructive protection and boundless, life-giving nurturing. In this ancient framework, the womb is revered precisely because it is the threshold between non-existence and existence.
It commands awe.
It commands awe, and crucially, it commands respect.
And the text doesn't isolate this to Eastern philosophy either. The analysis of early Christianity is particularly striking to me.
Oh, the Theotokos argument.
Right. The author examines the theological debates surrounding the Virgin Mary, specifically the use of that Greek term Theotokos by early church theologians.
Which translates directly to God-bearer.
Exactly. And the argument presented is that the birth of Jesus from Mary's womb inherently solidifies the womb as the chosen instrument for the manifestation of divine power on earth.
Because if the ultimate divine authority chose this specific biological pathway to enter the human realm,
The biological pathway itself is rendered sacred.
right,
The text then parallels this with indigenous traditions, focusing on the pervasive concept of the Earth Mother, and specifically the Navajo Great Mother.
where human anatomy is not separated from the ecological world.
Yeah, exactly. The womb is an extension of the Earth's natural rhythms, a source of absolute terrestrial and spiritual power.
And you can see it's a deliberate rhetorical strategy. By establishing this massive cross-cultural baseline of supreme reverence, the text makes the subsequent historical shift appear not as a natural evolution of medical science, but as a hostile ideological takeover.
So the obvious question arises then, how does a culture transition from viewing the womb as the cosmic matrix to viewing it as something requiring strict, clinical, often punitive regulation by male authorities?
Well, the author argues this required a calculated patriarchal vilification of the female body. She traces this ideological pivot back to the early church fathers, who systematically began to reframe female reproductive capacity from something divine into something inherently unclean.
Unclean and dangerous, right?
Unclean, dangerous, and tethered to original sin. The text leans heavily on a specific, rather infamous quote from St. Jerome, who explicitly described woman as the gate of the devil.
That specific phrasing, the gate of the devil, is such a massive psychological rupture from the concept of the Theotokos.
It's a complete 180.
But playing devil's advocate for a moment, one could argue that early Christianity also featured texts emphasizing spiritual equality.
Yeah.
So how does the author reconcile that with this idea of a coordinated vilification?
She reconciles it by focusing on the institutionalization of power.
Yep.
While early, decentralized spiritual movements might have harbored egalitarian ideals, the argument is that as religious institutions formalized and sought societal dominance, they required mechanisms of control.
Right, they needed authority.
Exactly. So by inextricably linking the pain of childbirth to divine punishment for Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden, the institution effectively weaponized the female body against the woman herself.
Wow, so if the womb is the source of humanity's fall from grace,
It can no longer be trusted to women. It must be overseen, regulated, and managed by a higher, purportedly more rational male authority. The text posits that this theological shift provided the exact cultural and psychological permission structure needed for men to assert dominance over female biology.
which perfectly sets the stage for the physical transition of power. Because once the ideological groundwork is laid, the text moves into the historical milestones of childbirth. And the contrast drawn between ancient practices and modern obstetrics is just stark.
It really is night and day.
In examining ancient Greece, the author notes a fascinating paradox. Despite Greece being a rigidly patriarchal society in its civic and political spheres, the actual room where birth occurred remained fiercely matriarchal.
Because men weren't allowed in the room.
Right. The knowledge of herbal remedies for pain management, the understanding of physical positioning, the pacing of labor, this was all proprietary knowledge held and executed by women. Midwives held distinct, respected authority in that specific realm.
And the shift away from that model, moving into the 18th and 19th centuries, is framed in the book not as an advancement of care, but as an explicit historical theft.
And this is where the text requires the reader to confront the incredibly dark, deeply unethical origins of modern gynecology and obstetrics.
Yeah, this part is heavy. When we look at the foundations of the medicalized approach, we cannot ignore the historical data the author presents regarding Dr. J. Marion's Sims.
Who was often taught as a pioneer.
Right. In older traditional medical textbooks, Sims is frequently and unironically lauded as the father of modern gynecology. However, the source material focuses entirely on the horrific reality of his methodology.
Which was completely brutal.
It was. His pioneering surgical techniques, specifically for repairing vesicovaginal fistulas, were developed through brutal, repeated, and unanesthetized experiments conducted on enslaved black women in the American South.
And the text names them right. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy.
Yes, specifically women named Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy.
The inclusion of that history is vital to the book's broader argument about whose pain is validated and whose bodies are sacrificed for the advancement of the institution.
Absolutely.
The text argues that the very bedrock of modern obstetrics is inextricably linked to the physical torture and total subjugation of marginalized women.
But if we look at the broader timeline of the industrial era, Proponents of modern medicine would point to the drastic drop in maternal and infant mortality rates over the last century.
Right. So how does the text address the argument that moving birth into hospitals, despite its flaws, was ultimately a net positive for human survival?
The text addresses that by decoupling the eventual benefits of things like antibiotics and sanitation from the actual systemic architecture of the hospital birth.
Oh, I see.
The author argues that the initial relocation of childbirth from the home to the hospital during the Industrial Revolution actually resulted in catastrophic spikes in mortality.
Due to puerperal fever, right?
Exactly, which was spread directly by doctors who did not wash their hands between performing autopsies and delivering babies.
That is just horrifying to think about.
It is. So the argument is that the move to the hospital was not initially driven by a proven increase in safety, but by a desire for convenience, efficiency, and the consolidation of authority among male physicians.
Because the home was unpredictable.
The home was an unpredictable environment where the midwife ruled. The hospital was a controlled environment where the male doctor was the supreme commander.
And that's when we see the shift in physical positioning, too.
Right. This era saw the introduction of women being strapped into stirrups, a position that works against gravity and narrows the pelvic outlet, but provides the doctor with a convenient view, along with routine episiotomies and the rising reliance on surgical extraction.
So the birthing woman was transformed from an active participant executing a physiological function into a passive patient undergoing a medical procedure.
Exactly. And when you fundamentally alter the environment and the power dynamic of birth, you fundamentally alter the psychological and biological reality of the person experiencing it.
Which brings us to a major section of the book focusing on the physiological toll of this highly managed environment and the systematic shattering of what the author calls the myth of the blissful birth.
We all know the basic hormonal players here.
Right, oxytocin facilitating contractions and bonding, and cortisol driving the stress response.
But what's fascinating is how the text maps that neurobiological reality directly onto the architecture and procedural norms of the modern delivery room. The author argues that the standard hospital environment is practically engineered to trigger cortisol.
It's a critical biological paradox, isn't it?
It is. Evolutionary biology dictates that for a mammal to safely give birth, the parasympathetic nervous system must be dominant.
So they have to be calm.
The animal must feel secure, unobserved, and safe from predators. If a threat is perceived, cortisol and adrenaline spike, activating the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response.
And that literally stops labor.
Yes. This biological override is designed to halt labor so the animal can escape to a safer location. The text applies this directly to the human experience in a modern clinical setting.
Because you think about it, a woman is placed in a brightly lit, sterile room,
Continuously monitored by machines,
frequently examined by strangers.
and largely stripped of her physical autonomy. This environment is read by the primal brain as a sustained threat.
So cortisol stays high.
Consequently, cortisol levels remain chronically elevated, which actively inhibits the release of endogenous oxytocin. The medical environment, designed to manage the birth, inadvertently stalls the physiological process,
Thereby necessitating the introduction of synthetic hormones.
and further medical interventions to solve a problem the environment itself created.
It is the definition of a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the author connects this clinical detachment to a broader societal issue, referencing the book Our Bodies, Our Lives, Our Voices by Ellen Bravo and Tempest Williams.
Right, a pivotal reference.
The text draws on their work to critique how modern culture has developed an intense fetishization of the fetus, often at the direct expense of the living, breathing woman.
The author describes a cultural ideology that increasingly views the pregnant woman primarily as an incubator.
And the psychological devastation of that vessel mentality is profound because it dictates that as long as the baby is extracted healthy, the physical and emotional trauma inflicted on the mother is irrelevant collateral damage.
That specific cultural narrative, the insistence that a healthy baby is the only metric of a successful birth, is identified in the text as a powerful silencing mechanism.
Because it enforces that expectation of the blissful birth.
Society demands that the mother instantly project pure joy and fulfillment. But the text shatters this expectation by relying heavily on clinical literature regarding postpartum mental health.
She cites Karen Kleiman and Valerie Davis Raskin's foundational works, right?
Yes, the Postpartum Depression Survival Guide, and this isn't what I expected. Alongside Kim Thomas's comprehensive analysis in birth trauma, by integrating these clinical texts, the author moves the argument from theoretical grievance to documented medical reality.
Exactly, because we aren't just talking about the baby blues here. We are talking about severe.
Not at all. The demand is for legally mandated, comprehensive discussions of the risks and alternatives of every intervention well before labor begins, as well as policy shifts that legally protect traumatized mothers and integrate long-term mental health support as a non-negotiable, fully funded component of standard maternal care.
And the moment you begin demanding structural policy changes and government funding, you are inherently acknowledging that the human body is a political entity.
Yes, inevitably.
This transitions us into what is perhaps the most heavily argued section of the book: the politics of the body and the business of birth. The author asserts that the womb has always been, and remains, the ultimate political battleground.
State and institutional powers exert immense energy regulating who is permitted to give birth, under what circumstances, and with what level of dignity.
The historical evidence she marshals here is difficult to read, but absolutely central to her thesis regarding systemic control.
The evidence is staggering, precisely because it spans both historical atrocities and contemporary crises. The text points directly to the long documented history of forced sterilizations.
Right, this is not an abstract concept.
No. State-sponsored eugenics programs have actively targeted marginalized communities, specifically women of color and indigenous populations, well into the 20th and 21st centuries.
The state forcibly removing a woman's reproductive capacity is framed as the ultimate violent assertion of political dominance.
Furthermore, to illustrate the global scale of the issue, the author cites reports from the World Health Organization and UNICEF detailing that approximately 303,000 women die from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth every year.
The text frames these deaths not as unfortunate medical anomalies, but as the direct result of political systems that chronically under-resourced and devalued female life.
She also uses major legislative shifts to highlight how quickly rights can be granted and revoked based on the political winds.
Right. She heavily contrasts the 2018 referendum in Ireland, which successfully overturned the Eighth Amendment and legalized abortion, framing it as a monumental victory for grassroots feminist organizing.
With the recent overturning of Roe v. Wade in the United States.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which she views as a devastating, coordinated reclamation of state control over female bodily autonomy.
But the text doesn't stop at political control. It dives aggressively into economic control.
Chapter 14.
Yes, chapter 14 of the book is titled The Commodification of Birth, and it maps out the multi-billion-dollar medical industrial complex.
The economic analysis in this chapter is meticulous. The author argues that modern obstetrics functions as a massive corporate entity that inherently prioritizes billable procedures and profit margins over the physiological pacing of the individual.
The core concept unpacked here is the cascade of interventions.
Let's talk about that.
This is the reality that one routine medical intervention almost inevitably alters the body's natural state in a way that necessitates a second, more severe intervention, which requires a third, and so on.
All right, let's trace that cascade because it perfectly illustrates the economic argument. A woman enters the hospital and is administered an epidural for pain management.
The epidural frequently causes a significant drop in maternal blood pressure.
So to counteract that and ensure labor doesn't stall, the medical team administers pitocin, a synthetic hormone.
Pitocin induces contractions that are often much stronger and closer together than natural oxytocin-driven contractions.
And this intense, unnatural rhythm can cause the fetal heart rate to drop, triggering alarms for fetal distress.
And the mandated clinical response to fetal distress is an emergency cesarean section.
And from an economic standpoint, the author notes that every single step of that cascade generates distinct, lucrative billing codes.
Every single one. The initial monitoring, the anesthesiologist for the epidural, the synthetic hormones, the continuous electronic fetal monitoring,
The surgical suite.
the surgical team, the extended postpartum recovery stay required for major abdominal surgery. All of it exponentially increases the financial yield of the birth.
A highly medicalized surgical delivery is vastly more profitable for a hospital than an unmedicated, complication-free vaginal birth.
The text frames this system not merely as capitalist opportunism, but as an explicit economic war against women.
By saddling new mothers with crippling medical debt simply for reproducing.
The system effectively ensures their continued economic subjugation and reliance on patriarchal labor structures.
But the author does offer subversive counter-strategies, which is important. She highlights grassroots initiatives actively working to dismantle this financial trap.
She specifically champions the birth fund, established by the National Advocates for Pregnant Women.
This fund operates outside the traditional insurance matrix, right?
Yeah, directly covering the costs associated with midwifery care, doulas, and birthing centers, allowing women who otherwise couldn't afford it to opt out of the hospital system.
She also points to the democratization of information through telemedicine.
Applications like Pregnancy Tracker and Baby Center. While sometimes commercialized, they are cited as vital tools that allow marginalized or rural populations to bypass expensive medical gatekeepers and access essential prenatal education and peer support.
That concept of bypassing traditional gatekeepers seamlessly transitions into the text's analysis of modern media and the broader cultural war.
Because the medical industrial complex doesn't just rely on policies, it relies on a pervasive cultural narrative to maintain its dominance.
The author views media as a profound, double-edged sword in shaping how society perceives, fears, and prepares for childbirth.
The critique of negative media impact is sharp. The text points to the era of reality television, using MTV's 16 and Pregnant as a prime example.
The argument being that while these programs masqueraded as cautionary documentaries,
They fundamentally sensationalize the dramatic elements of teen pregnancy for ratings, while entirely failing to accurately depict the grueling systemic challenges of long-term motherhood.
but her most vicious critique is aimed at the modern influencer economy and the baby registry industrial complex.
You look at YouTube or Instagram, and the algorithmic consensus is that competent motherhood requires purchasing 50 designer onesies
$1,000 smart bassinet that monitors the baby's breathing.
and an endless array of sterile plastic gadgets. The text argues this consumerist barrage preys entirely on the anxiety of new parents, convincing women that they are inadequate before labor even begins if they haven't purchased the right aesthetic.
It distracts from the profound primal reality of giving birth and reduces it to a capitalist shopping spree.
However, the author is careful to recognize that media can also serve as an incredibly effective tool for liberation.
Right, it's not all negative.
The text identifies Ricky Lake's documentary, The Business of Being Born, as a pivotal cultural flashpoint.
That film successfully bypassed institutional censorship to expose millions of women to the exact medicalized cascade of interventions we just discussed.
Offering visual, compelling proof that alternatives like home birth and midwifery were not just viable, but often safer and more empowering.
Furthermore, the author highlights modern digital movements, such as the Break the Twins hashtag, which acts as a radical rejection of the bounce-back culture by celebrating the raw, unfiltered reality of postpartum bodies.
The text also specifically praises modern birth influencers like Evans, who deliberately utilize their platforms to amplify the voices of marginalized women, trauma survivors, and those who have successfully navigated or rejected the medical industrial complex.
You can see how the author views these online movements not just as passing trends, but as vital tactical strikes in a larger ideological war.
Definitely.
And that ties directly into the text's endorsement of eco-friendly birth practices, choosing a home birth, rejecting single-use plastics in the delivery room, utilizing sustainable organic materials.
The author frames these choices not merely as environmental preferences, but as a deliberate political rejection of the sterile, wasteful, capitalist hospital environment.
It's an attempt to realign the sacred act of birth with the natural world. But this brings us to a critical juncture in the book. It's easy to talk about home births and organic materials if you have the resources to access them.
The author pivots hard in the final sections of the book to address the absolute necessity of intersectionality.
Yes, the author insists that any movement advocating for birth liberation must fundamentally center the most marginalized demographics. Otherwise, it merely replicates the existing power structures with a different aesthetic.
The data utilized here is an undeniable indictment of the current system. The text cites comprehensive reports from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention demonstrating that Black women in the United States are 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women.
And the author vehemently rejects any attempt to attribute this disparity to biological differences or individual choices.
Instead, the text frames this statistic as the fatal combination of systemic racism, implicit bias within medical training, and the chronic dismissal of Black women's pain by healthcare providers.
She compares the American maternal healthcare system to a gated community. It functions beautifully if you are inside the gates, but it is built upon the exclusion and suffering of those kept outside.
And she extends this intersectional critique to the immense gatekeeping faced by trans and non-binary individuals navigating reproductive care.
The text highlights how rigidly binary the medical system is, resulting in pervasive transphobia and cisnormativity.
Non-binary or transmasculine individuals giving birth are frequently misgendered, subjected to invasive questioning, and forced into administrative and clinical boxes that violently erase their identities.
To philosophically anchor this demand for systemic overhaul, the author heavily references the ethos of the Combahee River Collective, the foundational Black feminist organization.
Their central tenet, that true liberation for Black women inherently requires the destruction of all interconnected systems of oppression, including racism, sexism, and classism, is applied directly to the politics of birth.
The author's thesis is that birth equality cannot be achieved by merely tinkering with hospital protocols. It requires a radical dismantling of the socio-political structures that make marginalized bodies vulnerable in the first place.
Which inevitably leads to the most controversial proposition of the entire book.
Right. If the patriarchal capital system is deemed unsalvageable, what is the author's blueprint for the future?
This is where she leans into her calls for female supremacy by analyzing matriarchal societies. The text incorporates anthropological studies, specifically citing the work of Dr. Lisa Roberts and Dr. Emily Arnold in their paper Critiquing the Matriarchy, Potential Pitfalls and Challenges.
Now, given the radical nature of the book, you might expect the author to frame matriarchies as flawless utopian societies. But her engagement with Roberts and Arnold's work is actually surprisingly pragmatic.
It is a highly strategic inclusion. By directly engaging with the pitfalls of matriarchy, acknowledging that female-led societies are still human systems susceptible to corruption, internal disputes, and the potential misuse of power.
She preempts the criticism that she is merely advocating for a naive utopian fantasy.
Exactly. She isn't arguing that women are inherently morally pure. She's arguing that the structural design of matriarchal systems historically tends to limit massive power imbalances better than patriarchal systems.
The takeaway she extracts from Roberts and Arnold is not that matriarchy is perfect, but that it offers superior blueprints for shared decision-making, communal resource allocation, and a fundamental societal respect for the life-giving capacity of the female body.
It's a fascinating rhetorical maneuver, and as the book looks toward the actual physical future of birth, it confronts the looming reality of advanced technology.
The text dedicates significant space to analyzing the potential impact of artificial intelligence, robotics, and virtual reality in the birthing space.
AI could theoretically predict preeclampsia with astonishing accuracy. VR could offer immersive, non-pharmacological pain management during intense labor.
But the author remains deeply skeptical.
The skepticism is rooted in the historical pattern we discussed earlier regarding the industrialization of birth. The text poses a critical question. Will these advanced technologies be utilized to genuinely empower the birthing person and enhance their autonomy, or will they simply become the next iteration of hegemonic control?
Will AI algorithms, trained on biased medical data, further entrench racial disparities?
Will continuous biometric monitoring via robotics merely serve to further detach the medical provider from the human being in the bed?
The author warns that without a fundamental shift in the power dynamic, technology will always serve the institution first.
To ensure that shift occurs, the author argues for a total overhaul of how we educate people about birth.
She brings in cultural philosopher Laura D'Olimpio to critique traditional societal messaging, which the author argues conditions women to believe they must have children to be socially validated, while simultaneously withholding the actual, unvarnished truth about the physical and psychological toll of the process.
The text demands a pivot away from hospital-sponsored birthing classes, which the author claims are essentially compliance training for patients,
And advocates for independent, doula-led, comprehensive education that aggressively centers bodily autonomy and teaches the mechanics of informed refusal.
and perhaps counterintuitively for a text advocating for female supremacy, the final tactical point the author makes involves the radical repositioning of fathers.
The text argues that the patriarchal system relies on the strict division of labor, categorizing childbirth and child-rearing exclusively as women's work.
By demanding that fathers become deeply educated, intensely present, and actively responsible partners in the delivery room, the author suggests that patriarchal gender norms can be fundamentally subverted at the exact moment of birth.
When a male partner is forced to bear witness to and share the emotional burden of the profound power and agony of birth,
It shatters the illusion of male superiority and mandates a dynamic built on deep structural respect.
it's the ultimate Trojan horse strategy, dismantling the patriarchy from inside the delivery room. And that brings us to the end. of an incredibly dense, provocative mapping of the source material.
To quickly synthesize the sheer volume of arguments we've analyzed today, the text begins by tracing the theft of the womb's sacred cosmic status by early institutional religion.
It maps the horrific racist foundations of modern obstetrics and the subsequent industrialization of the birthing process.
We unpacked the biological reality of how clinical environments suppress oxytocin and induce trauma, effectively creating the very emergencies they claim to solve.
We also examined the author's extensive critique of the medical industrial complex, detailing how the cascade of interventions functions as an architectural feature of an economic system designed to profit from medicalized birth.
We analyzed the dual role of media as both a consumerist trap and a tool for grassroots liberation.
And finally, we explored the author's uncompromising demand for an intersectional revolution, one that confronts systemic racism, rejects transphobic healthcare models, extracts structural lessons from matriarchal societies, and redefines the roles of technology and partnership in the birthing space.
It is a staggering thesis. And again, as we wrap up, we want to reiterate that our goal today was to unpack the architecture of these ideas.
Connie Riker's manifesto, with its explicit calls for female supremacy and systemic dismantling, is designed to be incendiary.
But regardless of whether you find her arguments compelling, fundamentally flawed, or deeply offensive, engaging with texts like this is vital.
You cannot accurately map the current cultural and political battlegrounds regarding bodily autonomy, healthcare equity, and gender dynamics without understanding the most radical arguments actively shaping the perimeter of the debate.
To leave you with a final thought to analyze on your own, one that expands upon the text's central theme of invisible societal control, consider the actual linguistics of birth.
This is fascinating.
In standard medical and social parlance, we commonly say that a doctor delivers a baby, a phrasing that linguistically positions the medical professional as the active savior and the primary agent of the event.
Even when we say a woman delivers a baby, we are utilizing a verb historically rooted in the transfer of goods or property.
We rarely say a woman simply births her child, a verb that would grammatically center her as the active, autonomous creator.
If a single, universally accepted verb implicitly frames a woman as a passive vessel, rather than the active source of human life, it forces a critical evaluation of our everyday vocabulary.
How many other common idioms, clinical terms, and casual phrases are actively yet invisibly dictating our foundational understanding of biological agency and societal power?
That is an incredibly potent question to end on. Language truly is the code that programs the cultural matrix. Thank you so much for taking this extensive deep dive with us today.
If this analysis challenged you, provoked new questions, or sparked your intellectual curiosity, we highly encourage you to engage directly with the source material.
You can find the ebook, Birth, A Radical Awakening, available for purchase on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
For ongoing essays and updates from the author, you can follow her on Substack at Conrad Riker.
And finally, if you appreciate these thorough, impartial explorations of complex texts, please remember to like this video and subscribe to the show. We rely on your support to keep dissecting the ideas that shape our world. Keep questioning the narrative, and we will see you on the next deep dive.